everyone, I'm Tim Olson, creator of Pre-Med Advice, and today we are hosting Dr. Kyle Green. First, we will have Dr. Kyle Green flesh out his medical journey, and then we'll jump straight into a question and answer session with him. To begin with, I'll give you some background on him. He went to Harvard University as an undergrad. Following that, he earned his MD degree at the Keck School of Medicine, the University of Southern California. At the School of Medicine, he served as an admissions officer for the Board of Admissions. He then completed his internship year at Kauai Delta Medical Center and is currently a resident at the University of Rochester, pursuing a career in ophthalmology. In addition, he is the creator of KG MedPrep, a company that helps pre-meds edit their application essays. He uses his experience and knowledge as a former admissions officer. And so his accomplishments speak for themselves, and I'm excited to have him on here. Thank you, Dr. Kyle Green. You can jump in now. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. All right, well, hi everyone. My name's Kyle Green, like Tim said. Thank you for inviting me to this, Tim. And yeah, so I'm not sure where everyone is in their career right now. I'm sure a lot of you guys are in college. Maybe you just graduated, but you're all probably applying to medical school. You're interested in applying to medical school. So for this, it's mainly a Q&A, but I did want to talk about a couple of things. The first is just to go through my journey, how I got to where I am today, what I'm interested in. I'll talk about what medical school is like, what residency is like. And I also did start KG MedPrep, so I have a little bit of experience reviewing personal statements, extracurriculars, and interviewing as well. So I'll discuss some pitfalls, tips, and tricks. And just a part of my background, I did serve on the admissions committee at USC while I was a medical student. Most admissions committees at different universities are composed of professors and people outside of medicine, medical students, and it's really a diverse group that comes together to try and admit students and applicants who will make great doctors. So we'll get started. So this is a little timeline just going through here. College started back in 2010 for me. That's where most of you are right now. Medical school was 4 years. I did a research year at USC. I went to Kauai Delta, as Tim mentioned, for my intern year. I went to the University of Rochester, which was 3 years, or I'm going to the University of Rochester for 3 years for ophthalmology. And eventually I will be going to another university for fellowship. So as you can see, this whole stretch here is pretty long. It's about 15 years outside of college. So a lot of you are very interested in going to medicine. I think it's a great career, a great choice. With that said, it is just a huge, long, crazy journey. And you will be in your 30s by the time you have your real job. So it's a long haul. So there's about 15 years and 11 years in total. It's a long time. And what admissions committees are really looking for is students who are mature enough to appreciate that they're going into a career that's very, very long and arduous. What they don't want is someone who's just going in thinking they're going to graduate med school and then get a high-paying job and live this wonderful life. It is an arduous journey, and that's why the selective process is so stringent. So starting with me at college, I majored in neurobiology. I taught CPR classes. I lived in a house called Kirkland House, and I did some retina research. So whereas now I think it's very encouraged that you do all these extracurricular activities, I think it's okay to be like a student like me who was really focused and had very few things that I was interested in, but I spent a lot of time doing them. And then in medical school, I came back to USC. A couple big things about medical school. It's not as hard as everyone says it is. Some people will disagree with this, but I kind of found it to be like college part 2. Yes, you're studying more. Your weekends aren't really yours. You do have to do a lot of reading, be in class a little bit more than you would expect. But it's not hard in the sense that like, you know, a difficult math class would be hard. It's hard in the sense that you just have a lot to learn. So it's just the volume of information. Next is that your specialty interests will change. Everyone goes into med school thinking there'll be a certain specialty, and most often it changes. It certainly changed for me. And then just to recognize that it's like drinking from a fire hydrant. There's just too much to know in too little time. So during medical school, right after my 3rd year, I did a year of retina research. When you go into a field like ophthalmology that's very research heavy, sometimes you have to take an extra year outside of medical school to do it. Some students use a year to get their MBA or MPH, it really depends, but it's becoming more and more common. So whereas you might think of medical school as a 4-year program, for a lot of people that's evolving into a 5-year program, and they can use that 5th year however they'd like. And then I spent about 2 years on USC's admissions committee. I read applications, personal statements, I interviewed students, I discussed with committee members. I don't do that anymore. I think it would be strange if I had like a editing company where I help applicants and I was on the admissions committee. I don't even think it's allowed. But I was on it for a couple of years and it was a wonderful experience. And through it, you get to kind of craft the class of people that will become great doctors. So I'm about to go to the University of Rochester where I'm doing ophthalmology. This is eye surgery, medical and surgical treatment of eye problems. So very diverse field. You get to use some cool technology. You get to do weird stuff where people come into the emergency room with like hooks in their eye and stuff that'll gross you out. But I think it's great. Things about residency. It is as hard as everyone says it is. It steps up a notch. Medical school is hard. Residency is definitely harder. And when you're considering whether or not you want to do this career, or when I'm talking to anyone who wants to consider this career, this is the question I ask them. Are you willing to go through residency? It's a grueling, grueling process. You have more responsibility, exponential learning, and you also are making pennies into your 30s. So you do not get paid well. You have a lot of debt. Don't be mistaken, medicine is a huge, enormous sacrifice. But with that said, it's one of the most rewarding jobs, and you get to have real responsibility starting in residency. So that's pretty amazing. I'm 28 right now, and at 28 years old, you're making decisions on a daily basis that will determine whether someone lives or dies. So you get a lot of responsibility at a young age. So now I just want to go through some common mistakes. These are also on the Instagram for KG Med Prep, which is the company I run. I do all the editing for it. And this applies to both personal statements and secondaries. So if you already submitted your personal statement or you're already applying, don't worry if you catch one of these mistakes in your personal statement. There's plenty of opportunities to fix it in your secondaries. And I wrote these because I had reviewed so many personal statements, like hundreds and hundreds of personal statements and hundreds of secondaries. And I started to notice the same exact problems in each person's personal statement. It's kind of amazing to me. You'll see them over and over. And, I saw a business opportunity, so I took it, but I also saw an opportunity to really help students avoid these really, really unfortunate mistakes that they make when applying. And generally, they're very easy to fix. So there's 7 points I've noticed, and I'll describe each one briefly. But first, I'll just go through the list. So number 1, death and illness is why I want to be a doctor. Number 2, hero worship of Dr. Wonderful. Number 3, timeline is unclear. Number 4, premature specialty choice. Number 5, maxing the word count. Number 6, rehashing the resume. And number 7, only showing, never telling. And you don't have to write anything down. I'll share this with everyone so you can just listen. So the first one, this is a big one, and it's kind of my favorite one. Death and illness is why I want to be a doctor. So the big mistake that everyone makes is when they're writing their personal statement, they almost always include a family member, a friend, someone they know in their life who has died or who is really sick. And then they say that and put comma, and that's why I decided to become a doctor. Now, if you do put that, it's okay. But remember, what admissions committees are looking for is someone who makes a mature, thoughtful decision about a very complex, challenging career. If I have an applicant and their mom died and that's why they wanted to be a doctor, you say, okay, well, it's terrible that your mom died, but 10 years from now, are you still going to want to be a doctor? Really, the decision to go to medical school should be based off of a series of factors, and you want to make sure someone isn't making a rash decision. So while it's okay to mention it in your personal statement, I think it's important not to make too big a deal of it. So that's why I have 3 points. 1, keep it honest. Only mention the death or illness of a loved one in your personal statement if it really, truly influenced your decision to go into medicine. If it didn't, we can tell. We can sniff it out. Keep it personal. Remember, your whole statement shouldn't be about someone else who is sick. It should be about you, your character, your interests. And finally, keep it short. If you do mention it, just keep it pretty brief in your personal statement. So that's a big one. Number 2, hero worship of Dr. Wonderful. So most of us have done some form of shadowing. And most people, or a good portion of people, discuss the person they shadowed in their personal statement. The problem is they often spend a very large amount of time talking about how great that person is. They'll talk about such a great doctor, great with patients, compassionate, intellectual, I want to be just like him. And it gets to the extent where they're more talking about that doctor than they are talking about themselves. So if you ever do talk about someone who you're shadowing, again, keep it short and tie it back to you. What attributes do you see in them that you want to reflect as a physician yourself? So one thing that's really important. This is probably the biggest thing. Timeline is unclear. Admissions officers, including me when I was reading personal statements, you read them in 30 seconds, 1 minute, 30 seconds, no more than that. And if you have a very complex, metaphorical, back and forth timeline, it's real tough to read. What I recommend for I'd say 98% of applicants, keep a chronological order to your personal statement. Don't start out your statement in, late in college and then go back to when you were 5 years old. Some people can do that. You have to be an excellent writer, but a very, very small percentage of people can pull it off. And if you do try and go out of order in your personal statement, you have to have really, really good clarity, which is the second point. And then finally, conciseness. Just again, don't, if you are doing a chronological story or a chronological order of talking about your life in a personal statement, make sure things are short and sweet. You don't want to spend too much time on one point. Number 4, premature specialty choice. So kind of the funny thing is, I always say everyone wants to go to medical school to be a neurosurgeon. And it might surprise you that it's actually not that competitive of a specialty to get into. It's just that by choice, people end up choosing not to do it because the lifestyle is so bad. They're working like 80, 90 hours a week in their 40s and 50s. They do get paid well, but it's hard to have a personal life as a neurosurgeon. And after a rigorous 4 years in med school, at the end, you start to say to yourself, do I really want to do that? So coming from college, a lot of college students, they haven't been to med school yet. They haven't done residency. They haven't really seen medicine on a day-to-day basis. So they come in wanting to be one of these big name specialties. And admissions officers can kind of suspect that. And a lot of people shadow neurosurgeons. Shadowed a neurosurgeon. I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. But what you really want to be is open-minded. And this can be in your secondaries or your personal statement. Just make sure you let the admissions committee know, or don't mention anything at all, that you're not committed to a single specialty, because that can be a red flag for someone who is going to be really disappointed when they encounter the realities of medicine. So that's one tip. 5, maxing out the word count. I won't dwell on this. Just everyone asks me, do I have to fill out the word count? No, you don't. Don't needlessly fill space. It annoys the reader. If you can get to your point in 75% of the words, that's beautiful. And I know that everyone says sometimes subconsciously people think a statement is better if it's longer. I like to give people on admissions committees more credit than that. I think they can really tell a good statement from a bad one, irregardless of the word count. And sometimes a thing for me is if I read this really long statement and it's exhausting, I'll just feel annoyed unless it's actually making a point with those words. So make your words count. Number 6, rehashing the resume. This is a big one. Some people spend their personal statement or their secondaries just reiterating what's already on your activities. I promise you, we read your activity section. We see your transcript. We know your academic background and we know what you're doing. So you don't really need to go in and rehash every point on your resume. Save that for your activities. And don't by any means mention your GPA in your personal statement. That's not good. Finally, only showing, never telling. This one's important to me. People are going to differ on this, but you're always told show, don't tell in your personal statement. Show, don't tell. And there's a couple things I want to say about that. I'll just read this. Applicants are often told show, don't tell when crafting their personal statements. While this is generally good advice, exposition or telling is always critical. So I like to say the advice show, but also tell, right? Lots of times students fill their personal statement with anecdote after anecdote, but they never really get to the point. So while it's important to tell stories and kind of show why you want to be a doctor or show why you feel prepared to go to medical school, you also at some point need to tell. You really need to just explicitly explain to the admissions committee why you want to go to medical school, what type of doctor you want to be, and you want to explicitly discuss that you have made a thoughtful decision in applying to such a complicated, challenging, changing field of medicine. And to make sure you show, don't tell, just remember context. You can, if you do show and tell lots of anecdotes, you need to contextualize that with telling. Cut down the meaningful anecdotes. Meaningful anecdotes can breathe life into an otherwise dull, dry personal statement, but don't overdo it. So again, I wouldn't tell 5 different stories in your personal statement. It'll just tire out the reader. And then clarity. Try not to overdo the indulgent diction and flowery prose that comes with storytelling. So I always say you're not Shakespeare, right? They don't want Shakespeare to be a doctor. They want a doctor to be a doctor. So you don't They want to make sure you can write and you can put words together, but you don't. It's unlike college, right? You don't necessarily have to be a brilliant storyteller. You just need to get your point across and make a persuasive argument. Okay, so those are my 7 points, just to give you, and I'll send this to you guys if you're still in the process of writing your personal statements or your secondaries. And hopefully you can pick up a piece or two. If you would like me to edit, I do offer services for that. And if not, hopefully you can find something useful here. So I'll exit out of here and we can answer any questions that anyone has. So you can ask me questions about applying to medical school, questions about what it was like for me to be on the admissions committee, pitfalls that I saw with students, what residency is like. Really, I'm open to any questions.
Thank you. That was super informative. I guess I'll jump in. What would you recommend, like, in writing your secondaries that's different than writing your personal statement? Is there anything in particular to secondaries?
Yeah, it really, really varies. I think some of the old secondaries from last year are published, or probably most of them are. But really the point I try and make is you don't want to rehash what you've already said in your personal statement. And that's one of the main points I make, is don't rehash the resume. So sometimes people will just, I don't know, it's strange. It's almost like they'll copy paste what was in their application and put it into their secondaries. And it's very noticeable, I know you guys are spending a lot of time on your applications, and so but when you're someone like me who reads an entire application in 4 minutes, if something's redundant, I can tell almost immediately, and it jumps out and it detracts from everything else. So my big piece of advice on secondaries is be original in that secondary. Try and come up with something interesting. Try and be creative. Secondaries are really an opportunity for you to kind of go out of the box a little bit. If you played it super safe in your personal statement, just make yourself interesting on the secondaries. With that said, sometimes secondaries will ask very, very pointed questions. If they ask you, why do you think it is important for physicians to treat underserved communities? Which I think is just an awful question, because it always gets the same answer. It's really boring. The most interesting questions are usually kind of more controversial. If you ask someone why it's important for doctors to serve the underserved, you'll get the same exact response every single time, which is why one of my pieces of advice is to try and be a little bit creative. But if they do ask you a pointed question like that, you just kind of got to answer it. Sometimes you got to be generic.
Okay. And when you say creative, do you mean like not necessarily like giving like a story, but like maybe like kind of just coming up with a creative answer, right? Or
yeah, I should be careful with that. Not creative in the sense that you write like a very creative flowery response, but creative in the sense that, think outside the box, really dig into your past. Just I guess instead of saying be creative, I would just say be interesting. You don't need to give a rote generic answer. You don't need to be super safe in your secondaries. Just
which is definitely harder than because I think when I've been preparing essays, people say like be creative. I kind of think like, oh, maybe storytelling, but then I realized it's a little easier to do it like that. It's kind of like the easy way out, and it doesn't really get the point across.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting point that you bring up. Now, I think someone is asking a question.
Oh, thank you, team, for organizing this webinar. So, Dr. Green, so basically, I'm more like the older student. So, I graduated from my undergrad back in 2016, and I'm in my gap year. So, when you apply for medical school, how do the admission committee look at you? Like, what I'm also working, and then also at the same time taking classes to review my academic to get better. So.
So that's great, because a lot of people always ask me that. Sometimes they're worried about taking a gap year. Sometimes they're wondering if they should take a gap year. I think I look at it neutrally. I don't have a good opinion or a bad opinion of it. It really depends on what you do with that gap year. I think it can be wonderful for students to get a little bit more experience after college and get a little bit more maturity. It's totally neutral. The only thing that would make it bad is if you spent 2 years really doing absolutely nothing. But it doesn't sound like you were doing that. If it is to improve your grades, that's great. I think how a lot of admissions committee members look at it is you have, like I said, it's a 15-year journey, sometimes longer, to becoming a practicing doctor, 1 or 2 years after college. who cares? It's meaningless in the context of things. So whether or not you apply right out of med school or you take some time, it doesn't matter. That's what I think most people believe.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So in the chat, someone from Yi is asking, hoping to apply to schools that offered merit-based scholarships. I'm wondering if you know there's any specific qualification that admission committee is looking for. Long story short, what kind of applicants stand out to you?
I know merit-based scholarships are very, very rare in medical school. And this is a little off topic, but I will say something about finances. I remember when I was applying to medical school, I was very concerned with getting scholarships and lowering my debt load. But once you get into medical school, it's important to remember that yes, your debt is going to be very high. I'll just share with you, my debt for med school is close to $400,000. But once you become a practicing attending, the real true salaries are upwards of $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year. So you're going to pay off your debts. I wouldn't worry too much about merit-based scholarships. Let's get a $50,000 scholarship for medical school. Okay, now your debt goes from $300,000 to $250,000. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that much. So I always recommend focus more on the school you kind of want to go to, that you think you're going to be successful at. And ultimately, finances, once you're in medical school, it is stressful to go into debt, but it'll take care of itself. With that said, if you're still interested in merit-based scholarships, I would say what makes a student stand out is nothing different than what would make you stand out for medical school in general. Merit-based is just as it sounds, merit-based, right? So if you're selecting amongst applicants for that, it would be good grades, extracurriculars, someone who seems passionate, someone who seems down to earth. The criteria are essentially the same as anyone who would be applying to med school.
Interesting. Okay, so from Jessica, she's asking, what advice would you have to give when writing your extracurricular activities?
Yeah, this everyone gives kind of different advice on this. Some people say, I know it's told to medical students a lot of the time, is definitely show more than tell. Again, telling stories and anecdotes. And while I think that's important, it really depends on the extracurricular activity. It's helpful to have anecdotes. It's also helpful to have exposition, where you just kind of explain the activity itself, right? Like if you were a member of Save the Monkeys Club, okay? Like it's pretty clear what that is to me. You don't really need to tell me what the club is about. I know it's about saving the monkeys. But if your club is the women's empowerment on ice skates or something like that, you're gonna have to explain that. It's helpful to actually have a few sentences where you're like, this club is about this. I just chose the two most random examples for club names. You get my point. If you think a club needs explaining, or you think an activity needs explaining, take a couple sentences so the reader knows what you're talking about. If it's very clear what the activity is, like tutoring, you don't need to tell me what tutoring means. Sometimes in activities, for instance, I'll see like at the top tutoring, and they'll be like, I helped students, study different subjects, including chemistry, and it's just like, it's very redundant. I already know you're tutoring. And then another big thing I would say when it comes to activities is just make sure you keep it nice and concise. Again, sometimes people always try and fill the word count, but really, if it's a very simple activity, like I play violin, you don't need to spend 10 sentences talking about how you play the violin, unless you did some concert or won an award or something. It's okay to keep it nice and short.
Interesting. I already sent in my extracurriculars, so, but I think that would have been good to know. So you're saying less is more?
Yeah, it doesn't hurt. I will say this. It really, I think I said a lot of things, but if I could boil it down, your activity section, it really depends on what activity you're talking about. Some students will make every single thing in their activity section look exactly the same and speak like a job interview. Some people will make it seem very creative and tell anecdotes in each one. It just really depends on the activity, it's important to remember there's no strict rules. There's no strict rules. Just as long as you're clear, the reader knows what you're talking about, and you briefly discuss, and you briefly ensure that you explain the activity.
Okay, interesting. Pratouche is asking, as an admissions officer, are the students with an X factor valued, aka more likely to be accepted than the students with experience throughout the
You know, everyone is so different, and there's really no one factor or one big thing that stands out that makes me say like, oh, this person's going to be a great doctor. One part of the medical profession is you want really holistic people, and so I think students get worried that they need this or that. A lot of people always ask me like, oh, how important is it to have a publication? And I'm like, well, it's not that important. It's more the big picture. You know, if a publication helps explain you, then it's useful. But really, when I'm looking at an application, I want to see, is this person humble? What's their character? Have they worked hard? Do they have some appreciation for research? You want to see that they have all these aspects that will come together and make a great doctor. So it's kind of like the anti-X factor. There's no one big thing that'll make someone stand out. I think often I'll see someone with this amazing accomplishment, you know, or there'll be someone, for instance, I think at an applicant once, they had like 5 first author publications, right? And you'd think like, wow, they have such a great shot. But they ended up being one of the most terrible interviewees I've ever seen in my life. And I'm pretty sure they didn't get into anywhere because they came across as very arrogant, and their character wasn't reflected well. So if you're kind of mediocre in every single section, grades, research, extracurriculars, but you come off with a good interview and you seem like a good holistic student and we think you'll be a good doctor, you know, you can get in. There are students who are really lacking in certain areas in their application that get admitted because holistically they pull it together, they pull it through. So yeah, I would say there's no one X factor to put it.
Brenda, she's asking, do we need to have shadowed a physician before? What kind of experiences are important to highlight?
My opinion is no. I don't think it's important that you shadow a physician because shadowing, I almost think when people shadow, they get a false sense of what medicine is, because they go in, they see a doctor for one day, they see them at the end of their career, this shining, competent, wonderful person, but they don't see so much the journey. So I'm always worried when someone only shadows, they don't really get an appreciation for what medical school or residency is going to be like. So to answer that, no, it's not super important that you shadow. If you do shadow, that's good. You can mention it, and it's nice. But it by no means makes or breaks an application. And if you didn't shadow, I wouldn't worry about it. The only thing you really need to demonstrate is that you have an understanding of what a career in medicine looks like. And they want to make sure that you look mature, or that you sound mature, that you are mature, and that you're making a thoughtful decision to go to medical school. So again, it kind of ties back to my previous answer. There's no real one, you know, you can be lacking in certain categories and not in others, and it ends up being okay as long as you have a holistic good, if you present yourself holistically in a strong way.
Interesting. What about like direct patient contact? Is that more favorable than shadowing?
You know, I'll say the only, I know it's really hard to get direct patient contact when you're in college. I don't see it very often, to be honest. Most people, I'd say 90%, if they have any form of patient contact, it's usually shadowing. That's how it's almost always done with students. With that said, for students who have scribed in the past, I view that very favorably, because if you have been a scribe like in the emergency room, you really know what you're getting yourself into. So that's like the only thing I have a strong opinion of, that kind of stands out to me. But if you have not scribed, don't worry about it. Don't become a scribe. It's very few students do it. And if someone asks me like, hey, I'm going to apply to med school, do you think I should go be a scribe? I would say no, just apply to med school.
Interesting.
But yeah, you know, that's one thing. You are not accepted into medical school, so I do not expect you to have any sort of patient contact.
Okay. All right. Nicolettori, she's asking, I'm a non-traditional student, and I did not want to become a doctor until I was probably around 25. Is there any downfall to deciding later in life that this is what I want to do?
I love this question. So I would think the exact opposite. I think if I'm reading your personal statement, if I'm reading your whole package, I would be very impressed that you decided later in life. it's very easy to be a kid like I was and look up to doctors and want to be a doctor your whole life and stick to that path, right? It actually takes a lot of courage to be 25 and decide you want to start this career, because it's going to take you a long time, right? You're going to be almost 40 by the time you get a serious paycheck and by the time you're able to pay down your debts. And like if you're applying to medical school at that age and you take to think about it, it's impressive. And especially if you've gone through a journey to where you've gone to the point where you want to apply now. No, I think that's great. I actually think that's a strength. Non-traditional students are always super worried because they're outside of the box a little bit, but I found that non-traditional students often are the ones who stand out the most and do really well. So just take that and throw it out of your mind. So you're in good shape.
All right, Min Pham. He's asking, will the admission committee look down at classes that we are taking at the community college, either during your first 2 years in the community college or during post-bac year? Then he goes on to say, I went to a community college first 2 years, transfer to 4 years, post-bac taking classes both at extension and community college.
Yeah, I would say absolutely they would not look down on this. Absolutely not. Everyone has a different path in life. Not everyone can go to some expensive or great college right off the bat out of high school. If you went to that community college and you got C's and F's, that would be a problem. That would be a big problem. But even so, you could explain yourself. What's really important, I've always said what's really important about your journey is the trajectory, right? Where you ended up, not where you were before. And the same with the question from the person who just asked about being a non-traditional student, probably spent much of her life wanting to do something else. Maybe she went to this or that college. It doesn't really matter. It's where you are now. How did your journey get you to where you are now? And if I see that someone went to community college, I actually don't even think about it. I just shrug my shoulders. The only time it would take notice is like if you, let's say you went to MIT and you got a C or a B, I'd be like, okay, it's like a competitive class. If you went to community college and got a C, it is a less competitive environment, and I'd be worried if they're getting bad grades there, how are they going to survive in a very competitive pool in medical school? But even if you're in that situation, you can explain it away. Like I've said before, medical school admissions is more of an art than a science. So people always have these questions for me about things that the committee will look up and down upon, right? And it's all about salesmanship. It's all about how you present yourself. Even something that you might think would crush someone's application, you can spin it to make it seem like a good thing. And honestly, if someone's able to take something bad in their application and explain to me what they learned from it and how they're going to use it to change their behavior in the future, I think that's a net positive.
Cool. Okay. Pertush is asking, if I want to do an MD PhD program, do you know what's different in the application process from just an MD? Are there scholarships awarded for MD PhD similar to PhD programs, grants, fellowships, scholarships?
Yeah, so in the US, there's two ways to get an MD PhD. There's the stupid way and the smart way. Stupid way is the way I might do it, where you get your MD, you pay for medical school, you do some research and get really interested in it, and then go pursue your PhD. That is the stupid way. The smart way is how most students do it in the United States. They know from college they want to do MD PhD. It's the same application. You just, at the top, you say you are applying to MD PhD. It's fully paid for by the government. You do not pay you get a stipend for your PhD. Your medical school is covered. With that said, it is 8 years of your life. Even if you graduate college, if you do an MD PhD, it's likely you're going to be 40 years old by the time you get any form of paycheck or have any semblance of authority in your job. And that's kind of, for me, that was scary. But then you get older and you're like, oh, I could have done it. But yeah, it is different in that respect. And when you are applying as an MD PhD, you need to have much more emphasis on research, right? They're giving you a bunch of government money, and they can only take a few MD PhDs in the country. And by a few, I mean a few hundred or whatever it is. And they just really want to know that you're not doing it just to get a PhD and to have a cool title. They want to know you're doing it so that you contribute to the field of research and the field of medicine. So in that sense, it's much different than an MD application. And an MD application or a DO application, you can be very honest about what you want to do in your life. Maybe you just want to be a rural country doctor, or maybe you just want to be a urologist in a private clinic. Maybe you just want to be a surgeon. Maybe you want to like teach, whatever. As an MD PhD, you basically are going to be a big time researcher, and you need to sell yourself as a big time clinician researcher where you're going to be treating patients and you're going to be, pipetting for several years. So important to remember that. A little bit.
What if you present yourself in that later version as like an MD PhD applicant, as an MD applicant? How does that look? Are admissions going to say, oh, you should be an MD PhD, maybe you don't know what you're doing? Or
no, I think even as an MD you can still be a big reresearcher. Usually the PhD is just there it just helps out for grants and things like that. But yeah, I'd say like if you're an MD PhD and you didn't get in and then you go apply next year, or in the same cycle you apply to MD, it really doesn't matter. MD PhD applicants are generally top tier. And I would say most people who apply to MD PhD generally already have a astoundingly great chance of getting into a regular MD or DO program. So most programs would be happy to take them.
Okay. And then from Meron, have you known any med students that realized medical school wasn't for them? If so, what were some particular reasons that they changed their mind? What do you think are some bad, shallow reasons to go to med school according to admissions?
That's a wonderful question. Yes. That happens all the time, even at great expense to them. And it's not surprising. And I even had a colleague who I went to college with at Harvard. We both went to USC Med School, and she dropped out after 3 months. Not because she wasn't smart or wasn't capable. She just realized, I do not want to spend the next 10 to 15 years of my life doing this. It's too much work. What medicine does is it takes a hit on your personal life. It takes a hit on your time off. You don't have as much time to enjoy yourself. It's stressful. It's thankless most of the time when you're in training. You're not getting paid. You're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars for the privilege of learning. It's just stressful. It's immensely stressful. And then, people get into it, and I think it's good they decide early, because they just say, I don't want to torture myself with this. And think about that. After all the work they did in getting into medical school, a couple months they want out. So that is why admissions is so particular about people who demonstrate that they are aware of what medical school is going to be like, right? I almost say in your secondaries or wherever, it's okay to sometimes mention explicitly, like, I know this is a sacrifice. I know this is going to be difficult. And that's kind of what we want to see. We just want to make sure that applicants are aware of what they're getting themselves into. With that said, I hope I didn't turn anyone off from what they're doing. It's an amazing job. But like any amazing job, it's a lot of work to get there. At the end of college, you are just getting started. You're right at the beginning, and you have this huge, long, arduous path ahead of you. And a lot of people go into medical school not realizing that. Another thing you said is bad or shallow reasons. I think that too. I think people kind of suppress the idea of hard work, and they want to be a doctor because it's fun to have doctor in front of your name in society, and it affords you a lot of privileges, and you get to make some good money. But those things will not sustain you. If you go into medicine to make money, you're making a huge mistake. Because by the time you're 30 or 40 and you're actually making money and you've actually paid off your debts, you have better enjoyed yourself, or you're going to be miserable. So that's why what we're really looking for is people who would go into this field, even if the money wasn't so great, who really wouldn't think they're going to like treating patients, who want to be compassionate, who have an interest in science and research and evidence-based medicine. We want to see that holistic picture. So that's what I always ask people. And on interviews, it's kind of mean for me to ask it, but I always like to ask them, like, so how hard do you think this is going to be? And it's really informative sometimes what they say. When they tell me, like, on interviews, when they tell me, I know this is going to be hard, I know it's a big sacrifice, but I want to make it for X, Y, and Z reasons, that's reassuring to me.
How are you able to express that you know that it's going to be super hard, since you, like, as applicants, we haven't gone through it yet? Is there like advice on how to
really just saying it explicitly. Even if you haven't said it in your personal statement, even somewhere in a secondary, I think it's worth saying somewhere. I chose medicine for X, Z, Y, and Z reasons. I know it is a sacrifice, and I know how difficult it will be. Just a kind of an acknowledgement, you know. Another way to do it is, you know, interviews are offered like all the time to just good academic applicants. And the interview is used to find out more about their character. On the interviews, it's a really, really great opportunity to say, to get across, you know, it's better to do in language, how hard, you know, it's going to be. And that's reassuring to the person who you're interviewing. You just want to come across as mature and thoughtful.
Cool. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's okay, so Ashwin is asking, how are medical mission trips viewed?
Yeah, I don't see them that often, but that's good. It's more how you frame it. You know, if you just ask me how they're viewed in general, I'd say neutrally, very neutral about it. If you describe how, you know, what you learned from it and something you learned about medicine from it and how you grew personally from that experience, then I'd say that's great, super useful. And if by medical mission, sometimes that refers to something religious. People ask me if they should mention religion or not. It doesn't matter. We know people have religious beliefs. When it comes to being a doctor, diversity is important. Skin color, religion, sexuality, all that does not matter. That's not important. It's important that you can add to the class as a part of that diversity, but it would never ever detract, right? So if that's kind of what you're getting at, then yeah.
So going off that, how are you able to express, show your own diversity? Because I know like the majority of students are either Asian or Caucasian. So a lot of people, including myself, are kind of looking at that as like, oh, how do I express diversity?
Yeah, I think there's two sides of the coin to that. One is at some point you just can't change the fact that you might not add that much to diversity, but you can reflect in your writing that you understand and appreciate the importance for diversity. And honestly, I think that's more important. I think what's more important than being diverse sometimes is just having an appreciation for a diverse class. If you're the type of person who wants to be surrounded by those that are different from you, that look different from you, that act different from you, that think different from you, then you're just a good learner. You're just someone who's really open-minded, who's going to do really well in medicine. Because as physicians know, you're going to encounter immense diversity on the medical floors, on the units, and you need to be able to deal and appreciate and respect different people. So that's what you really, if you're not contributing to diversity yourself, you need to demonstrate that you understand how important it is. You don't have to, but it can be helpful. And if you do contribute to diversity in whatever way, then it's you can discuss it, and that's helpful as well.
How would you look at someone who's not like ethnically diverse, but is saying that they're diverse through their activities? How is that looked upon?
Yeah. So this is where it's all about showing and not telling. This is kind of one of those exceptions, right? Like I would never advise someone to say, look at how diverse I am with my activities, because it kind of comes across as kind of awkward, you know, and cheesy. But if you demonstrate through your activities that you have different interests, that you interact with different people, that you're open-minded, that's really the key. That's where it comes down to showing.
Okay, cool. All right, and then Brenda is asking, could you please lay out the path of a medical professional for someone like a surgeon? I am not clear of terms like internship, residency, and such.
Sure, yeah. So after medical school, you decide on a specialty, and that specialty is going to be a different residency, right? So some of the residencies are very general, like there's a residency called general surgery. And then after medical school, you spend 4 to 5 years becoming a general surgeon. There's residencies for medicine where you just do 3 years of medicine, and then you can sub-specialize into cardiology, GI, things like that. And also there's things called sub-surgical residencies. So they're surgical residencies, but they're specific to different things. So there's like urology, where you're a surgeon of the bladder and kidneys and things like that. There's ophthalmology, where you're an eye surgeon. There's ENT, where you're a nose and throat surgeon. So that's what it really is. Residency is just basically your specialty. After medical school, you need to go get specialty training in residency. And internship is just your first year in residency. That's all it refers to. For some specialties, you do your internship at a different place. Sometimes it's at the same place. It's just one more year of your residency, your first year. And it's most often the worst year.
So your internship is like internal medicine?
So I did a transitional year where I did a couple months of emergency medicine, a month of general surgery, a couple months of internal medicine. It's a mix. I go to my optimal.
All right, Dr. Green, I have a question actually. For your residency, how did you choose ophthalmology?
Yeah, so like I said, I was one of those people who wanted to be a neurosurgeon. And then I realized they have like 80, 90-hour work weeks, and I just couldn't do it. Ophthalmology it's a good specialty because you do a little bit of medicine, medical management of the eye. You do get to do surgeries. You get to sit down during surgery, which is awesome. And I just kind of got fascinated by the eye itself. I like the retina. I did a lot of research. I like the treatments. I like the diseases. I like the diagnosis. I like the people. And the people that go into it are generally really nice and thoughtful. So it's a good, well-rounded specialty. And it's kind of hidden. A lot of people don't know about it when they first go to medical school and they kind of discover it. There's actually a lot of specialties in medical school that you kind of come across and you've never heard of, like PM&R and a bunch of others that are just off most people's radar and off the public's radar. But once you find them, you're like, wow, this is kind of a great life. And you realize like, you kind of make this decision outside of college and you start living in the real world. You're like, I really don't want to be a 45-year-old who spends like 12 hours in the OR standing up. That's just kind of like, ooh. Some people do it and God bless them. But yeah, that's how I can. Yeah. Oh, sure. If you have a question, you can ask me. I don't see anything in the chat from you in particular. Okay. Yeah, you can go ahead and throw your question in the chat. If not, I'll just move on to the next one, which I actually wasn't keeping track of where we were.
Oh, I skipped one by accident. Pertush asks, are there clubs on campus, organizations that med students can join for personal interests and hobbies?
Is this for medical school? For medical school, yeah, absolutely. But it's less nice than college. Normally, you just kind of get with a group of friends and organize whatever interests you have. But yeah, there are tons of clubs. Unfortunately, in medical school, the clubs are mostly more oriented towards like things in medicine, like journal clubs, specialties, things like that. But in terms of personal interests and hobbies, yeah, you just kind of got to do it yourself. You know, medical school classes, unlike college, are small enough. Sometimes they're 80 to 100 people. It's a small enough group to where you just kind of, if there's a group of people interested in mountain hike and like rock climbing, you get a group with 3 or 4 and you go do it. So yeah, you still get to live your life and have hobbies and stuff like that. It's not as organized in college as colleges.
Because you're kind of more busy, right?
You're busy and it's a smaller group and you're just kind of focused. And if you do have off time, which you will, you just kind of organize it yourself. You don't really, yeah, there's not many like hobbies or there's not like the swimming team, you know what I mean? It's not like that. They did have like an ultimate frisbee team. Med schools can be weird, but yeah, it really depends.
How is it connected to the overall school campus?
Oh, it totally depends. USC, where I went, the medical campus is completely distinct from the college campus. And honestly, whenever you go to medical school within your first week, you will no longer feel like a college student. You'll feel like a medical student. You'll be so detached from the rest of the university. Honestly, I went to USC. I didn't even feel like I went to USC. I just feel like I went to some random med school because you're so dug into what you're doing. And what's very different about college and med school is I know when I was applying to med school, I actually cared about rankings, but they're just so unimportant for medical school. The rankings and things like that, it does not matter. Whether you go to Harvard Med School or whether you go to med school I've never heard of in Idaho, you can get the same education. It all comes down to how much you study, how much effort you put in, right? It's not like college where you have to learn from this professor or that professor. Medical school is very, very self-directed.
Interesting. Yeah. So that drew you to USC because of its ranking largely?
For me, it was more like I cared a lot about that at first. I wanted to go to a school that was reputable, and also I wanted to go to a certain location. So I'd spent a lot of time in the East Coast, and I'm from Southern California, so California was kind of standing out to me. But then I'd realized later, once I went to medical school and once I was on the admissions committee, it really doesn't matter where you go for medical school. It's not super important. And even when we get applicants from colleges, that's not too important either. The ranking of your college does not really matter. What matters is how you performed and how you did, right? Like I said, one of my colleagues from Harvard, we went to the same med school, she dropped out. We had plenty of my other classmates in med school were from very small colleges that had no ranking, were from nowhere, and they were incredibly successful. And that's all that med schools care about, is getting successful people who will be good doctors. And in terms of where you come from what college you come from, and in terms of what medical school you eventually go to, does not matter. Also, I like to make that point about MD and DO, does not matter. Does not matter once, it seems like it maybe once you're applying, but once you're an actual practicing physician, I don't go up to my colleagues looking at their badge, trying to figure out where they went or what they did. All I care about is that they're trained, and they know what they're doing, and they can do their job. After 15 years of training, you stop worrying about labels and background in your resume. You just worry about the job you're doing, right? When you have like patients in front of you that can live or die, that's what you care about. You don't care about degrees.
Interesting.
Or schools.
Yeah. If you have an average GPA, average MCAT score, how do you strategically pick your list of medical schools? From Jessica.
Yeah. It depends what you mean. If you're super, first of all, if you're average on those academic measures, you can stand out in terms of your story, your extracurriculars, your dedication, things like that. So you can stand out in other ways. That's the first thing I would do. But if it's truly average, I mean, you just need to do your research, and you need to look into like the average GPA and MCAT of schools. Like I said, it really doesn't matter where you go. Well, let me say this. The only time it matters which medical school you go to is where they can match their applicants. So sometimes there are certain med schools that if you go to it, you're going to have a tough time matching into competitive specialties like dermatology. If you want to match into dermatology, unfortunately, you just have to go to kind of a really good med school. But with that said, if your goal is to just get into med school, and you can pick your specialty choice later, trust me, just do your research. I'm sure it's published somewhere, just the average MCAT, average GPA places, and strategically just try and get a list that seems reasonable, The same thing when you apply to college. I would have like 70% of them be ones that are reasonable. I'd have 10% that like just find, if you really, really want to go to med school, find 10% that will like definitely take you. And then I'd throw in 10 or so % of reaches, doesn't hurt. People who are, I would even say, I don't like to use the term underqualified, but let's say underqualified, can end up at top med schools.
So is that, were you surprised when you got into Harvard, or was it kind of like in your reach, or?
That was a reach school for me.
Interesting.
In high school when I was applying, but I think it kind of is for everyone, right? Like especially if you're playing to Harvard Med School, or you're playing to Stanford or whatever, right? That's a reach for everyone. And if you get in, great. If you don't, hopefully you got into the group that you thought you had a good chance of getting into. And if that didn't work out, then it's probably, I would reapply, try next year and change your strategy up a little bit. Sometimes you just get unlucky. There's a component of luck in this process, unfortunately. And you have to account for that. That's why I always tell people, like, not everything is in your control when you're applying. But the things that are in your control, you want to really be careful with. You want to really master.
Interesting.
Anything can happen.
Yeah. So how is your MCAT going into?
Yeah, my MCAT was the old system. So mine was when you took 3, I think it was physics, verbal, and biology. And I think I was like 85th, 90th percentile in terms of the score, somewhere in there. It's different for you guys. I think it's now it's not like the median is 500 and it goes up to something. Yeah, so all I would care about is percentiles, whether you're using the old system, the new system, just where you are percentile wise. And if you don't do your grade on your MCAT, it's okay to pick up in other areas of your application. But for me, and me as an applicant, I had a decent GPA. I had mostly A's with some B's sprinkled in. I had a good MCAT. My extracurriculars were lacking. I didn't, like I said, I only had a few, but I was super focused on research. I didn't do a lot of other stuff. I joined like no clubs. It just didn't interest me, but it worked out. I did pretty well in the application season, and ultimately I came back to Southern California, which is where I wanted to go. But if I could go back, there are definitely things I would change. Now I spend a lot of my time editing people's personal statements. I went back to my personal statement and just cringed because I've made pretty much every mistake I talk about now.
I was gonna say, if you had like a decent MCAT, but not like a stellar MCAT, you didn't have like extremely stellar experiences, it seems like you were able to get into really good schools like USC because of your writing, or like how you wrote your activities, how you wrote your personal statement, which I think is like hard for a lot of science majors applying to med school.
Yeah, and I think it constantly surprises people. I mean, I think one thing important to remember about admissions committees is like, yes, obviously having better scores and better grades increases the likelihood that you will get into a better school. I mean, that's just basic statistics, right? But with that said, you know, if we just took the top 10% of MCAT scores in the nation and admitted them to medical school, it would be a nightmare, right? It would be a terrible class. We would get some terrible doctors, some arrogant idiots that can test well. And trust me, you do not want that. So that's why medical school admissions is different than a lot of other types of admissions. We want people who are compassionate, who care, who can explain themselves. You know, when you're a practicing doctor, do I really care that you did poorly on your physics section on your MCAT? Like, I don't, you know, who cares? Basically for me, when I look at an MCAT, I just want to know that you put the effort in, you know, you did well. If you didn't do well, you need to explain it. I might ask, well, did you not study, or what was the problem, you know? But if you did average on your MCAT, that's okay. That's pretty neutral. I don't get super excited about it. I don't judge you for it. But I will look to other areas of your application, right? Because you have to remember, if you already have a strong MCAT and strong grades, right, then you can afford an issue here or there with your extracurriculars, you know, like this is a person who scores well, who studied hard, blah, blah, blah. It's okay if they have some issues with other parts of their application. If you have an average MCAT and you have an average GPA, you're kind of running out of excuses. Like now you have to stand out in terms of your character, right? And that's kind of the tough love scenario. And that's not me being like a mean person on the admissions committee. That's just the reality, right? Like if you had two people in front of you, one with good scores and one with bad scores, if you're going to pick, you're going to pick the good scores, but that's not what we do. You know, if we have those two, and we also have your activities and your personal statement and your secondaries, and we have your interview. The thing to remember about how this whole process works is once you get an interview, they think you're academically acceptable for medical school. Academically, you're going to be fine, right? They're not worried about that. So with an average MCAT, an average GPA, and average everything, you can get an interview. And once you get an interview, it's your time to shine, right? That's when you make the difference. That's when you really have to demonstrate how you're different in your character, in addition to your secondaries and personal statements, the human aspect of your application, right? So people get worked up about it a lot. Don't hyper-focus on the things that are bad in your application. Focus on the opportunity, just accept where you are and focus on the areas where you can improve or really show your character and show yourself. Because I'm telling you, there's one thing that prevents you from going to medical school. There's people who I think I've talked to who decide not to apply because their MCAT's average or their GPA's average, or they just think it's not worth the time. I mean, you know, I think they're kind of filtering themselves out, which is probably a good thing, because you want optimists. You want people who are going to give it a shot. And I say everyone has a shot.
What if you did poorly on a past MCAT and then you take it again and you're able to increase your score? How much should you like focus on that in your application, like about increasing your score, or should you just not mention it and wait for the interview to talk about it?
Yeah, so in terms of whether or not you would take the MCAT again, it's totally dependent on the application. If you're just kind of weak everywhere in your application and you have an average MCAT or a not so great MCAT, then I would definitely retake it. And you're going to have to do better, because it's pretty bad if you score poorly twice. In terms of how to talk about it in your application, you know, if you do average on your MCAT and then you take it again and you do better, it's worth mentioning it explicitly. Just be like, you know, I really want to, you know, I wouldn't say it like this. You want to go to school, right? You want to go to medical school. And look, I have demonstrated that I'm taking it seriously. I underperformed. I admit that I underperformed my first time. So here's what I did to fix it. I studied harder and I got this score. And if I read that, I'm going to be like, okay, like, they made a little mistake, but they fixed it.
Okay. Cool.
So it's okay. And there's like taboo about talking directly to the committee. Like, you can explicitly address things in your personal statement. You don't have to beat around the bush. Like, you don't have to say, there are certain parts of my application that I sought to improve and did. That's just going to annoy people, You can explicitly be like, look, I had a bad MCAT and I fixed it and it's better now. So that's kind of that's pleasant to read. When you
Now, what about people who have to take it multiple times? Because I have a few friends that did that, and one's applying next cycle, another one's applying this cycle. Like they took it 2 or 3 times, and then the 4th time they were able to nail it.
Oh, really? Yeah. I mean, I would never advise a 4th time. It doesn't hurt you. It's just like, it's not going to help you even if you do wonderful. At some point, you just kind of, I would say, at some point, you just got to accept the MCAT score you have. You can improve on it, great. But like, here's the thing: if you take it 4 times, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to ask, am I really going to care about that 4th score, right? Because like if you were 50th percentile your first time, you're 55th your second time, and your 4th time you were 70th, right? You have now had a lot of practice taking that MCAT. And I'm going to say, like, well, if we give everyone 4 chances, they might do a little bit better, right? So taking it, I would only recommend taking the MCAT twice if you need it. And if you do take it twice, try and make your improvement on that second attempt. With that said, I don't know, who knows? If they score just so amazing in that 4th time, and then they explain the first 3 times they had this going on in their life or whatever, if you explain yourself, fine, and again, I'm not going to look at those four tries and be like, oh, they made a big mistake. I'll probably just look at it and say, wow, they really want to do well on that test. They put in quite a bit of effort. I'm just not going to take too seriously the end result.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Alrighty. And then, so Sarah's asking, is having a narrative super important for med school applications? And if it is, how do we create one?
So what's important? Everyone has a narrative, even if you try not to, you have a narrative. I'm just interested as an admissions committee person. How'd you get here? You're applying to medical school. This is a big life decision. What did you do in life? What experiences did you have? And they don't have to be grand experiences where you worked with the top Johns Hopkins neurosurgeon, right? Like, I just want to know what you did to get you to this point. So in that sense, it's a narrative, right? A narrative is just being honest. And in terms, you don't need magical stories, wonderful things. Really, again, it just comes down to being simple. I just want to know that you're thoughtful, that you critically thought about this, that you recognize that it's going to be a difficult process, and that you're passionate about this field that you're going into. I want to, as cheesy as it sounds, I kind of want to know that you admire the field. I want to know that you admire physicians. And the narrative just helps explain why you feel those things, right? Like, you might say, almost everyone, tons of people in their personal statements say, I've always admired doctors. I admire doctors. And then the next thing should be like, well, why do you admire doctors? That's your narrative. Telling me why you think the things you do and why you are where you are.
Interesting.
And you don't need some beautiful flowing story. Like, you're not Shakespeare, you're not writing a novel, right? It doesn't have to be this cohesive, brilliant piece of work. Reality doesn't work like that, right? Like, for me, yes, I wanted to be a doctor for a long time, but I also wanted to be like a firefighter when I was 5 years old. And then I wanted to do engineering, and then I thought about this, and life is messy, right? And we understand that, but it doesn't have to be this beautiful narrative. But you should have points where you explain, why now? Why are you being a doctor? Why do you want to be a doctor?
Cool.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Doha, she's asking, actually, I have a problem with forgetting information in anatomy and physiology. Anything she learns, she forgets.
Yeah, you'll you'll learn by, yeah, I mean, medical school is just all memorization. You got to find fun ways to learn things. There's no way around it, And I think in college, the punishment or the penalty for not learning or remembering something is you do bad on a test, which you get over, right? The penalty for not knowing something in medicine, especially when you're a resident, is someone gets hurt. And after that happens, you don't forget anymore. Or someone will, like medical school can be a little grueling, a little bullying sometimes, unfortunately, it's just like that. And when someone who's your superior kind of, even if you're the nicest guy ever, they'll get mad at you if you don't know something, or if you don't remember something that's important, like anatomy or physiology. And unfortunately, it's not the nicest thing, but after they do that, you will remember. So I'd say in medical school, don't worry about it. Everyone always asks, how do I study best? What do I do? You'll find a way. Because if you don't, you'll be miserable.
So that's kind of like why the GPA is so important when admissions are looking at applicants, because if you don't have a good study habit going into med school, it's hard to develop it in there. Or
yeah, it's the reality. I mean, at the end of the day, like, what are grades, right? You might say like, oh, grades are like, it's harder to get an A at this school than that school, and it's unfair and blah, 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 blah. Well, that's true, but at the end of the day, your job is to try and make a good application, and we want the students who can make that happen. In medical school, and especially in medicine, when you're actually practicing it, life isn't fair. Things aren't fair, right? Like, your patients aren't the same as the patients next door. All that really matters is that you get the job done. And in terms of applications, you just have to get the job done. You have to present yourself well. So in terms of grades, like you said with GPA, like yeah, you gotta. The number itself isn't that important because there's outliers and things drag it down, and trend matters. But yes, in general, you should academically be doing well.
all right.
And if you're having a big time academically in college, honestly, I'd rethink medical school, because I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying in general, because it is very similar to college. It's very similar to college, especially the first 2 years. There's just more stuff to learn. It's like college plus, just more stuff, more time studying, but really you just have to memorize.
Okay. So does anyone have any questions that you want to ask through video or speaker?
I think there's one more too. It says, so I'm having a hard time explaining how my stories have impacted me, or reflections after I tell my story, what I've done. Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. I love that question, because what happens is people tell these long stories, these long, beautiful, well-written stories, and then they'll end it with some generic statement like, and that's why I want to help the underserved and be a compassionate, caring, competent doctor. And you're like, whoa, where did that come from? I get what you're saying there. People do that ad nauseum. They will tie up their stories in the most bizarre, weird ways. And my response to that is, you don't have to tie your stories into every time to some greater, big, meaningful purpose, right? Like admissions, the readers aren't stupid. They can read between the lines, right? Like, if you tell a story about a patient you interacted with, and how you helped them and how you were empathetic with them, you don't need to sit there 4 sentences after that being like, and this helped me foster my ability to care for people, which is important for physicians. You see what I mean? You can end it more simply by just saying, by having exposition and saying, this experience with this patient gave me the opportunity to demonstrate compassion, or gave me the opportunity to see how compassionate physicians influence like good care for their patients, or something like that, right? Just keep it really simple. As I said before, it's show and tell. It's mostly show. So you tell your story, you tell your anecdote. The anecdote itself should really get the point across, just like we can read between the lines of what you're getting at. And then usually I'd say a sentence or two at the end, just kind of gently wrapping it up. Don't go overboard, right? Keep it simple.
Cool. That's super helpful. I think that's a problem for all of us.
Oh yeah, and don't do that in your secondaries, or even your activities. At the end of paragraph, anytime I read secondaries, at the end of every person's paragraph, they'll put this grand statement and they'll just slowly list off and that is why I want to be empathetic and caring and help the others and travel the world and be an international doctor and use evidence-based medicine and you're just like, whoa, like what's like, you know, it's too much. Like it's okay to keep things simple. I don't need to know that you're gonna change the world, right? If you even in your personal statement, if you have this story where, like I said, you help someone and you end it by mentioning that you really enjoyed the opportunity to help them, beautiful. I get it, right? I can connect the dots that you enjoying helping someone is good for being a doctor, right? Like you don't have to explain that to me. So yeah, don't worry about it too much.
That's helpful. And with the services, with the KG Med Prep, do you help, like if you see that in someone's essay, do you kind of like point that out? Because you can't tell them like, oh, like you can't tell someone what to write because it's personal and you don't know someone's whole personal story. But would you point that out to just say, oh, you're doing a little too much here?
Yeah, because I always say, like, I when I edit personal statements, I would do it just, I work my brain like if I was on the admissions committee. If I see someone ending it very awkwardly or weird, I'll just cross it all out and be like, this needs to be changed. Or I'll add something like, maybe you should word it like this. But I think a lot of the times my problem is these people charge crazy amounts to look at personal statements and they just do editing words here and there. But I think the biggest problem with certain personal statements or secondaries is more the content. And that's what I really focus on, is making sure that your content makes sense, that if I'm a reader and I'm reading through your essay, that the timeline is clear and cohesive and makes sense, that you're not making these grand statements. And I also try and delete or make you aware of areas that seem very generic or cliche or awkward. Like I said, if I see this great story and it ends with a couple sentences that are just totally irrelevant or don't make sense or don't hold the mood of the story, I point it out. So that's the things I try and focus on. And it's a little bit different for secondaries than it is for personal statements. Because secondaries, it's like you said, it really depends on the person and they have a voice and you don't want to change their voice. But what I try and do is just essentially guide people to try and have a statement and have secondaries that are getting the point that they want to get across.
Cool. So Min Pham, he's asking, thank you for all the advice and helpful tips, Dr. Green. It was helpful, and I will definitely take all of them into consideration when I apply. Okay, cool.
Well, thank you. Well, you're welcome.
It's nice to hear that. So with the neuroscience, I was also a neuroscience major. Did you specifically state how that you want to go into neurosurgery in your personal statement? I know that you recommended not to, but did you like fall into that trap?
I think I didn't explicitly say that, but I did say like I shadowed a neurosurgeon and I love neuro, but like you could basically I said that, you know what I mean? And that's okay. Like I think if I read a statement where I said that, what I think is like, okay, well they think that, you know, their mind will change. It doesn't really impact how I think they are as a quality of the applicant. The only reason I recommend people take it out or consider taking it out is it doesn't add much, and it doesn't hurt you, but like it's when an experienced admissions committee officer is reading it, they know that you're probably going to change your mind. But that's okay. Like I said, with all these things, it really depends on the statement, right? And it's all about being honest. Like at the same time, if you honestly really want to be a neurosurgeon and you shadowed neurosurgeons and you're interested in the neurosciences and you explicitly state that, maybe that's true, you know, like there are people who go on in med school and they become neurosurgeons. So I would never hold that against anyone. I've seen a lot of statements where they kind of wrap it up almost by being like, and that's why I want to be a neurosurgeon. And it's like, well, you haven't even gotten to med school yet. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're kind of going 100 miles an hour, but they haven't even gotten on the freeway yet. That's kind of how I do it.
Jumping the gun a bit.
Jumping the gun, yes.
Was there something particular that you focused on in your personal statement when you were applying?
Mine, I think Jessica brought this up earlier about narrative. Mine really lacked a narrative, which when I read back, you know, as I said, it's not really a problem, but I basically had like 6 paragraphs. I had a paragraph, an intro paragraph. I talked a paragraph about research. I talked a paragraph about shadowing. I talked a paragraph about like my extracurriculars, and I basically made my own mistake, and then I rehashed my resume. I did not tell that many. I didn't really tell barely any anecdotes, and if I did, I think it was very generic. It was not, I wish I could go back and write it again because now I know all these things and I've read so many, but it was a very, very generic statement. I don't feel like I explained myself that well. With that said, if I was an admissions committee member now and I read my own statement, I would not be super excited about it, but I wouldn't be upset about it. I would just be like, all right, you know. And for me, honestly, like I said, it really depends on who you are. I had a pretty good GPA. I had a pretty decent grades. So my personal statement didn't have to sparkle. I just kept it nice and safe, and it worked out fine.
Yeah. Cool. And it also doesn't hurt to come from Harvard.
Yeah, so that's the thing. I had a pretty fair safety net, right? Like I wasn't super worried about getting in somewhere, and so the worst thing I could have done was have this like experimental, unusual statement, personal statement, and kind of risk my chances. So I played it very, very safe. I had a very bland personal statement, but even so, you can still have a safe statement and not have any glaring problems and still make it great. That's the argument I would make for myself if I could go back. You know, there's no reason why your statement can't hit all the major points that contribute towards your application. It's definitely a possibility. And I see you said for publications, is it really important to have a first author paper? No, I said this a little earlier. It's not important at all. You do not need a publication. Not expected. I think it's crazy to even expect college students to have to do research, let alone have a publication. There's plenty of time to research in medical school. In medical school, you'll have to do some research. What I care about more, because publications, it's very political. It depends on the timing. It depends on who you're working with. And first author is like, I mean, I like had my first author paper like a year ago, and I did a full research year. Do you know what I mean? So no, publications are not important. If you have one that is impressive, good. It only can help. But if you don't have one, don't worry. Just demonstrate somehow that you have some appreciation for the research. And let's go. There's a couple that just came up. How many colleges do you recommend applying to at once? Really, really depends on, how many colleges do you recommend? Assume you mean medical school. It really, yeah, it's super dependent. Honestly, that's a little bit outside of my experience because I only had been through that process once and I was only looking at applicants through one school. So that's more for like an admissions counselor or someone at your school who could answer that. And it really depends on how strong of an applicant you are. I applied to about 20 schools, which is on the low end, but I had a pretty good background to get in, so that's fine. If you're like an average student, you know, some people apply 30 to 40. It sounds like a lot, but that might be necessary, you know, if you really want to increase the likelihood you get it. And in terms of which types of schools, I always say, unless you are a very strong applicant, MD and DO. Doesn't matter where you go, just you want to give yourself an opportunity. And then you say, I have 3 years of pharmacy school experience. Will that hurt my chances of med school? I was unable to finish due to medical reasons. Will that raise any flags? No. Like I said, you can explain yourself, explain why, you know, life happens, right? Medical reasons is a legitimate reason why pharmacy school ended. And if you explain why now you want to go to medical school, I think that's great. If anything, like having basically a pharmacist now become a doctor is great. That's going to help you. So no, it won't hurt your chances, in my opinion. Can I guarantee there won't be some nasty admissions officer who will hold it against you? No, but vast majority of people won't be a problem. And then could you please briefly distinguish between MD or DO? So functionally, there's no real difference. It's more historical. MD schools tend to be more competitive to get into. And the only difference in terms of curriculum is DO schools are the exact same as MD. They just do some extra stuff based on like medicine, like adjustments and bones and muscles. And it's not taught that much anymore. So there's not much difference between MD and DO schools. The only difference is, like I said, historical. MD schools tend to be a little bit more competitive and they tend to match students into more competitive residencies. But in terms, I mean, if you want to go be an emergency medicine doctor, it does not matter. That degree does not matter. They're both the same.
Cool. It's a little different philosophy, right?
A little bit different philosophy, yeah. But then what happens is in training, depending on your residency, like I worked in an emergency medicine residency basically for 1 year. It's a mix of MDs, DOs, and you know what? We're all doing the same medicine. Like, you want to get a patient better, it doesn't matter what the thing says on your name tag. It matters how you treat them, right? And it's like, I think the only people that care about MD versus DO are honestly people that are applying to medical school. Because after you're in medical school, you don't care. It does not matter. And I know it seems like it matters for some people. It really doesn't. It really doesn't.
Now, DOs, would you say they typically go towards primary care?
It's much, if you're a DO and you go to primary care, you just have a lot more options, right? If you are a DO, so for instance, the field I'm in, ophthalmology, it's very, very rare to have a DO in ophthalmology. Very, very rare. But that's only because it's a small field and it happens to be competitive. With that said, if you're a DO and you want to do a certain specialty, you just have to work extra hard for it. So the only difference, there's no difference in the quality of doctor you are or the training or anything like that. The only difference between those two degrees is if you go to an MD school, it'll give you a better chance of getting into certain residencies and certain specialties. If you want to do primary care or emergency medicine or whatever, it doesn't matter. You know, if you want to be a cardiologist, that's fine. It's not going to change much. You can go do an internal medicine program and perform well there. If you want to do, like, I don't know, there's like interventional radiology, dermatology, ophthalmology, neurosurgery, certain subspecialties in medicine. There's like a list. It's much tougher to go that direction from a DO school, but totally possible. There's no rule against it. It's just kind of the way it is. Unfortunately.
Do you think it's maybe the education has? Do you think that plays any part in it? Like you'd have like slightly less competitive scores from your education?
Honestly, the harsh truth is, I mean, I think MD schools are slightly more competitive than DO schools, right? So if you're a program accepting residents, you tend to lean towards the MD schools because they've already been filtered out a bit for being really good applicants. So it's just kind of, you know, it's just for the same reason a law firm would go to one law school over another. There's just a higher likelihood that the applicant will be higher quality. With that said, there's no blanket statement. So if you are from a DO school, if I'm a residency program director and there's a student from a DO school and they're stellar, I'm probably going to invite them to an interview. And if they interview well, I'm going to rank them over the MD students. That's just the way it is, you know. So the further you get in medicine, the more real world it becomes, and the less rules apply, right? With that said, I don't like to sugarcoat things. In general, MD schools are more competitive. There's some overlap, but they're more competitive to get into, which can help you for certain residencies. That's just true. But in terms of how those two schools and professions are treated within medicine, there's absolutely zero difference.
Interesting. Very cool. I think you never really considered DO, right? As an applicant?
No, because, well, for one, the frustrating thing is that they use two different applications.
Yeah.
So I felt fairly confident that I could get into at least one MD school. So I just applied MD, yeah. But if I felt like I needed to kind of mix up my application and I wanted, you know, to have a higher guarantee of getting in, I would do MD and DO. Not only do you have two different applications to work with and two chances of getting in with different strategies, but it's just a greater number of schools you're applying to. It just depends what you're willing to do, you know. But and back then, I think I'll admit, I thought it mattered more, the difference between those two degrees. And I think everyone does when you go into this field. But like I said, now looking back, I could care less. I really could care less which type of school you went to. As someone who's going into residency, I'll be working with colleagues. I don't care about their degree. I just care that they went to med school.
Interesting. So Tashi, she's asking, would you recommend getting shadowing hours before applying, and how many? So I think you went over this.
Yeah. It can be helpful. It doesn't hurt. Like I said, it's all about your holistic application. So, you know, honestly, I personally would. It doesn't hurt. It's not hard to shadow. You just call a doctor, email a doctor, and be like, hey, can I shadow you a couple hours? And, you know, on your application, it might ask you for the number of hours you shadowed. It doesn't matter. I don't care if it's, for me, I don't care if it's 5 or 200, but if you can put shadowing on your application, maybe get a good anecdote out of it, sure. But if you don't want to, that's fine too. I think I shadowed one guy in clinic, a neurosurgeon, for like a few hours. That was my shadowing experience. It worked out.
At least you had something.
And if you did it, if you've been shadowing like hundreds of hours, that's great. Like I'm not trying to diminish it if you did do it. But like I said, it's applying to medical school. There's so many facets of your application that lacking in one, it's not like you have to hit every single one and be this and have this impressive thing, right? Like I think a lot of students come there like they just get paranoid. They're like, I have to have a first author publication in research, and I have to have perfect grades, and I have to have all these extracurriculars, and I have to be president of clubs, and I have to shadow all these doctors, and I have to like blah 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 blah. You know, you're not a robot. I get it. It's fine. We all get it. Just being a holistically strong applicant is important. So if you don't shadow, that's okay.
Cool. So how do you think your going into residency is going to be affected by COVID? Are you guys going to be meeting in person?
Oh yeah, that's kind of happening right now. So it was terrible at first because we were in the ICU and we had our first COVID patient, and there was very poor information coming out of China, so we didn't know what to expect, and there was no PPE and all that. Basically, this is also true of medical schools. I don't even think medical students are allowed to interact with the COVID patients right now, but for residency, all our meetings are virtual. And in terms of the hospital, we just go on with our regular work. But if you are going into medical school this year, it definitely has impacted it. If you're hopefully by next year, there won't be much change in terms of your personal experience with what's happening. I think policies will be very different. It's kind of like, it's kind of similar like post 9/11, how your airport experience was. Post COVID, your hospital experience is going to be quite different. It's going to be much more sanitary. You're going to be wearing masks more often. You're going to be tested more often until we have a vaccine. It's going to be a very different environment.
Cool. And what does residency kind of like entail? Because that's one area of medicine and the timeline that I'm not too clear about.
Yeah, so residency, you're basically a doctor, a fully practicing doctor with supervision. So I think people think you kind of have this attending looking over your shoulder, but really straight out of the gate of med school. Med school does not prepare you to be a resident, by the way, because your first day of residency, you're just like totally scared. But very quickly, you're a full practicing doctor. You make the decisions you need to make. You order medications, the medications go to the patient. And then what happens is if something gets complex or difficult or you have questions, you go report it to your attending, which is the kind of supervising doctor. And so you spend between however long your residency is, 3 to 7 years, learning how to be that type of doctor. And the funny thing about residency is you're learning how to be that type of doctor while simultaneously being that type of doctor. It's like if you've never flown a plane and then they just threw you in a plane and they said, you're going to learn it now, aren't you? And you do. That's exactly how medicine is. You're just thrown into the pilot seat, oftentimes without a co-pilot, and you just learn. You learn quickly.
That's pretty amazing. Are you doing that in a hospital?
Yeah, you do in a hospital. 100% of residency is in a hospital or a clinic. The first year of residency, known as intern year, is extremely stressful. It was stressful for me. It's stressful for everybody. It doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter what your background is. You're thrown into an environment where lots of expected of you. You have a ton of responsibility, and you're very ill prepared. As hard as medical school is, it's very cerebral, and you learn a lot of things, but you don't really learn how to practice. And you practice medicine in residency. So while medical school is kind of laying these foundations, residency is where you are training to be a doctor.
Wow, that's cool. So what do you think you learned the most out of your first year, or like your biggest pitfall and then your biggest achievement?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I think that the biggest thing I learned is you just kind of have to be humble and realize when you don't know something, you don't know something. You know, if I'm treating a patient and I don't know how to handle it, it's my responsibility to find the answer. And that's just very stressful to realize. So you have to go humble yourself, ask your attendings, talk to people, because ultimately it ends with you, right? If your patient, you'll get calls all the time like, hey, your patient has a high heart rate, it's 126. And now you're sitting there first day of residency, and you're like, even with med school, you're like, what do I do? Like, what do you mean no heart rate's high? You have to know what questions to ask. You have to be the one to address it. You have to figure it out. And you also have a short amount of time to do it. So it's just, I don't know if there's one thing I learned. It's just kind of learning how to solve difficult problems in stressful situations. And that's why doctors get paid so much, because they're in a very stressful environment and they have to do a very stressful job.
Wow.
But you get better at it really quickly.
That's inspiring. Wow. So with the emergency medicine, do you think that was more stressful than other kinds of internship? Like,
yeah, I did it because I think it's important for my specialty in particular, because we get consulted a lot in ophthalmology by emergency medicine doctors. But it's a very adrenaline driven specialty. It's fun. It is harder, I think, because you're under such a time constraint. But it's rewarding in the sense that you kind of quickly treat a patient, you see a difference, and then you move on to the next patient. Whereas sometimes with other specialties like medicine or cardiology, you could be treating a patient for 30 years and they'll just get sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker no matter what you do. So, but you'll just learn that in medical school. It really totally depends on what you end up doing.
interesting. If you're going into like surgery internship or, general surgery, do you still have that? Are you still able to treat patients like before and after surgery? Are you still getting that experience as like emergency medicine?
Yeah, that's kind of yeah. If you're a surgeon and you're in surgery residency, you're responsible for the patients before and after, whatever happens to them. Obviously in my field, like one of the reasons I chose it is because I don't have to deal with inpatients and there's not people who you get stuck with. I shouldn't say stuck with patients, but that's just how it deals. You get stuck with people who are real problems sometimes and there's no solution, and it's just like a huge frustrating thing. But yeah, surgeons, even in surgery residency, after surgery, if someone's really sick and they develop a bunch of medical problems, their heart stops working, you're responsible for it. That's your job. My advice is to not pick general surgery. Pick a specialty that's just like, I'm actually doing that right now. I'm spending a month in general surgery, and it's actually the toughest. It's just tough. Hours, people, everything. Pick something.
Okay. So I don't see anyone really asking that many more questions. I think I'm gonna ask one more question to wrap it up. Now I'm doing secondaries now. I'm preparing for secondaries, and I know I'm applying to a bunch of schools from top tier to low tier, and I know that there's going to be a lot of secondary essays for each school.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to prepare those essays before I get flooded with emails. Mm-hmm. For your services, if I type up essays, would you recommend going generic, like general questions, like most schools ask about diversity? Should I just do a template essay and get like the best draft I can out of it and then send it in for corrections from your company?
Yeah, so what I generally recommend is there's so many secondaries that at some point you have to copy paste. But what I find is that when people overly copy paste and when they kind of take generic essays and then submit them, you can tell when you're reading, when you're like on the committee and you're reading people's secondaries that they've basically copy pasted from another school. What I always find is you take a look at the question, and like if the question is diversity, usually you have a big long essay where you try to respond to it, and then you take key sentences and you kind of piecemeal it together. And it really depends on the school and depends on the secondary. If you can just copy paste one and it's totally the same as a different one, that's fine. But generally I try and advise people to make them specific to every single school. If you're going to a school in like, I don't know, southern Minnesota, right? That's diversity is going to mean something very different than if you're going to New York City. So just whenever someone's writing their secondaries, I just like to make sure they're very careful and that they know where they're applying to and that the responses in their secondaries are specific to that school. The worst thing that you can do is come across as someone who's lazy and copy pasted without any thought into that specific secondary. Because you can just tell when someone really cares about a school, when they really want to go there, you can tell they took time. You can tell it's well edited, and you can tell they put a lot of effort into that specific secondary.
Okay, so then maybe instead of sending you like a template one, maybe send you like a top choice school where the essay is tailored.
that's generally what I advise. I advise people. We have, I think the way we do it is like, you know, you can buy a certain number of edits or whatever.
Yeah.
I generally advise people, if they do get help outside for their secondaries, they do it with the secondaries that are most important to them. And yeah, I would agree, instead of editing like one big like template that you can pull from, which is an option, I generally think it's better when you have a specific secondary for a specific school and you try and work with it and focus it to make it really strong.
Okay, that's helpful. And Nicolette Todi, I'm definitely pronouncing that wrong, but she just wants to know the company name.
That's a great question.
And that's interesting how you have that experience on the Board of Admissions. So
yes, yeah, and if you guys let me put the email too. If you guys have any questions about this or want to ask me anything, you can go ahead and feel free to just email this email. It's the same as the website. Yeah, well, thank you guys. It was really a pleasure speaking with you all and answering all your questions, and I wish you all best of luck. Yeah, you're welcome. When you apply this season, it's stressful, but it's worth it in the end. And like I said, if you don't take away anything from this, I think the big takeaway is just to try and present your best self. It's okay to have weaknesses. Just try and explain them. And we realize you're human, and as long as you present why you think you'd be a good doctor and why you want to go to medical school, you're in good shape. And you're very welcome. If you do want any help with edits in your secondaries or personal statements or whatever, feel free to go to that website and check it out. Feel free to email me if you have any questions.
thank you, Dr. Green. This was super informative.
All right, and thank you, Tim, for inviting me, and good luck with you and your applications as well.
Thank you. All right, everyone. I'll see you later.
All right, bye-bye.
Good night.